You don't deserve this money, Diane. While you were playing nurse, I was building a career. Dad knew who was competent enough to manage the family's assets. Rebecca's words cut like blades as I sat, stunned, in the leather chair of Walter Green's office. Our father's will had just been read, leaving the $750,000 family home and $450,000 in investments entirely to my sister, while I was left with only $50,000 for 5 years of full-time care for both of our parents. Walter, our family's attorney, for over 3 decades, avoided my gaze, his reading glasses strategically positioned to hide any reaction to the document he had just presented. Dad knew I would manage the money better. Aunt Rebecca continued, adjusting the gold bracelet on her wrist. Don't worry, I won't let you end up helpless. The condescension in her voice stung almost as much as the betrayal written in that will. 5 years of my life dismissed. 5 years without a career, without vacations, without a life of my own. All ignored with a signature on a document that contradicted everything my father had promised me. This doesn't make sense. I protested, my voice betraying the exhaustion of someone who had just buried both parents after years of relentless caregiving. Dad explicitly told me my sacrifice would be recognized. Promises don't matter, only legal documents. Rebecca snapped, closing her Italian leather folder. Face reality, Diane. It's always been this way. At that moment, watching my sister's triumphant smile, the same sister who had visited our parents only a few times a year, always with a camera in hand for her social media, I felt something break inside me. Not just the loss of the inheritance I was promised, but the devastating realization that all those years devoted to my parents might have been for nothing. What Rebecca didn't know, what no one in that room suspected, was that my father, Thomas Harrington, wasn't a man easily fooled even in his final days. Somehow, somewhere, he had prepared an alternative plan. I just didn't know what it was yet. To understand how we reached this devastating moment, I need to go back 5 years, when I gave up my position as head nurse to answer my parents' call for help. 5 years earlier, I was at the peak of my career as head nurse at Providence Medical Center. I had just been promoted after 15 years of dedication to the hospital, and my professional life was finally receiving the recognition I had worked so hard for. It was on a rainy Tuesday that I received the call from Dr. Claire Sutton, a longtime family friend and my parents' physician. Diane, I need you to come to my office. It's about your parents. My mother's Alzheimer's diagnosis wasn't exactly a surprise. The signs had been there for months. The forgetfulness, the confusion, with dates, the objects misplaced around the house. But hearing the words spoken out loud by Claire made it painfully real. Margaret will need constant supervision from now on. Claire explained, her voice blending medical professionalism with the compassion of a friend. And your father, well, his blood pressure is getting more unstable by the day. I called Rebecca that same night. My sister was in New York, rapidly climbing the corporate ladder in marketing. Of course I'm worried, Di, she said, the noise of a corporate party buzzing in the background. But you know how my life is here. I just got promoted to VP at the agency. I can send money to hire someone. Money, Rebecca's solution. To everything that required emotional or physical presence. 3 days later, I requested unpaid leave from the hospital. It would be temporary, I thought. Maybe 6 months, a year at most. The hospital director tried to dissuade me. Diane, you're giving up years of progress. Please think carefully. But the image of my mother, lost in her own home, and my father trying to hide his dizzy spells while caring for her, weighed heavier than any career. I moved back into my parents' house that same week. My apartment was subleased, my independent life put on hold. The transition was harder than I expected. Going from a respected professional to a full-time caregiver daughter completely transformed my identity. The first months were a period of adjustment. I developed strict routines for medications, doctor visits, and cognitive stimulation exercises for my mother. I learned to check my father's blood pressure multiple times a day and to spot the signs of fatigue before he would admit them himself. Rebecca. called weekly for the first 2 months. Then the calls became monthly. The visits she had promised would be frequent happened only on major holidays, and even then, not always. New York to Providence isn't the end of the world. I would say, trying to mask my hurt with humor, "You don't understand the pressure I'm under here." She always replied, "Not all of us have the option to just drop everything." As if my decision had been a luxury, not a sacrifice. By the end of the first year, my mother's condition had worsened significantly. Her moments of lucidity became rare. Some days, she didn't recognize me, calling me by the names of old friends or, ironically, by Rebecca's name. My father, observing all of this, developed a quiet melancholy. At night, after Margaret fell asleep, we would sit on the back porch, where he used to smoke his pipe before the doctors forbade it. "She always favored your sister, you know," he remarked one evening, his voice carrying the weight of decades of observation. "It was never fair. It never has been. It was the first time he had spoken aloud what I had always known." Rebecca was the shining star, the daughter who had inherited our mother's beauty and charisma, while I was the pragmatic one, the reliable one, the one who would always be around. In my second year, Rebecca showed up for Christmas bearing expensive gifts and a photographer friend. "To capture family moments," she explained. What she really meant, to fill her Instagram with carefully curated images of filial devotion. The photographer spent the afternoon snapping pictures of Rebecca feeding, our mother, Rebecca, helping our father with his medication, Rebecca decorating the tree I had set up the night before. Once the photos were taken, she spent the rest of her 2-day visit on her phone, handling work emergencies. When she posted the photos, the comments overflowed with praise for her dedication. "You're such an amazing daughter. What a beautiful example of love. How do you manage to balance career and family so perfectly?" The irony was almost unbearable. It was in the 3rd year that my father's health began to decline rapidly. His blood pressure no longer responded to medication, and the doctors identified kidney problems that required dialysis 3 times a week. My routine now included taking care of my mother, who no longer recognized her own home, and transporting my father to exhausting dialysis sessions, waiting for hours in hospital corridors, the same hospital where I should have been working, not as a caregiver, but as a professional. One afternoon during dialysis, while my mother was under the temporary care of a hired nurse, my father gripped my hand with surprising strength for someone so frail. "Diane, I want you to know that I see everything. I see every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every missed opportunity." His eyes, framed by deep wrinkles, locked onto mine with a clarity he hadn't shown in a long time. "When all this is over, you will be rewarded. I'm arranging things." "I'm not doing this for a reward, Dad," I replied, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I know. That's exactly why you deserve it." He squeezed my hand again. "Trust me. Talk to Walter and Michael afterward. They know." In the 4th year, Rebecca reduced her visits to just 2 for the entire year. One for our parents' wedding anniversary, where she stayed exactly 26 hours, just long enough to take photos of a forced champagne toast, and another on Thanksgiving, when she brought a catered gourmet dinner that our mother could barely swallow and our father couldn't eat because of dietary restrictions. That was also the year I found my father late at night in his office, hurriedly putting away documents when I walked in. He looked almost conspiratorial. When I asked what he was doing, he simply smiled and said, "Assurances, Diane. Every good businessman needs assurances." The 5th year began with my mother no longer recognizing anyone. Her episodes of aggression increased, along with the nights she wandered the house, confused and frightened. My father, now confined to a wheelchair, watched helplessly as the woman he had shared over 50 years with slowly faded away. It was in March of that year that my mother passed. Pneumonia, a common complication in advanced Alzheimer's patients. Rebecca arrived 2 days after the funeral, lamenting that she hadn't been able to say goodbye properly due to an important client presentation. Our mother's death devastated my father. Within 3 months, he had lost 45 pounds and all but gave up on his physical therapy sessions. His words became rare, except for moments of unusual clarity when he would call me close. "Walter has everything documented," he told me one morning as we had coffee on the porch. "And Michael has kept something important. When the time comes, go to them." I tried to press for more details, but he simply smiled and changed the subject, as if he had planted a seed and was content to wait for it to grow when the time was right. During my father's final weeks, Rebecca finally showed up for an extended 5-day visit. She settled into the guest room, turned the living room into her temporary office, and spent more time in video conferences than sitting at our father's bedside. On the night before she was set to leave, I heard a heated argument coming from his room. I quietly approached the half-open door. "You can't do this, Dad." Rebecca's voice sounded controlled, but with an underlying fury I recognized from our childhood. "It wouldn't be fair after everything I've built." "Life is rarely fair, Rebecca," my father's weak voice replied. "Ask your sister." I stepped away before they could notice my presence, disturbed by the tone of the conversation, but lacking the courage to confront them. The next day, Rebecca left for New York, promising to return in 2 weeks. My father passed away 10 days later, on a quiet Sunday morning, holding my hand as I read him his favorite novel. His last word was a barely audible whisper that sounded like trust. Rebecca arrived just in time for the funeral, impeccably dressed in black, her makeup flawless for the photos. During the ceremony, she stood by my side, her arm entwined with mine, as if we had equally shared the burden of the past few years. "We're in this together," she whispered for the relatives' cameras as she strategically wiped away a tear, and that moment, exhausted and grieving, I truly believed that maybe we could overcome our differences. That the death of our parents could bring us closer as sisters. Little did I know that just a week later, we would be sitting in Walter Green's office, where Rebecca's true intentions would be revealed with a cruelty I never thought possible. Days following my mother's passing were the loneliest of my life. The house, once filled with the sounds of her confusion and the rhythm of our caregiving routines, was now wrapped in a deafening silence that even the old kitchen radio couldn't drown out. My father, who had maintained a stoic facade for years, visibly crumbled. It was as if Margaret's passing had taken with her some invisible pillar that held him up. 53 years. He murmured over and over, sitting in her armchair, holding a wedding photo. 53 years, and she left without remembering my name. I tried to comfort him, but how do you console someone whose other half had been erased, not just by death, but years before, by disease? My father was mourning twice, for the wife he had just buried, and for the woman Alzheimer's had taken from him long before. Rebecca sent a huge flower arrangement for the funeral and a voicemail broken by sobs, explaining that a crucial meeting with Japanese investors kept her from coming immediately. "I'll be there as soon as I can," she promised. Like so many times before, she arrived 2 days after the funeral, when the last condolence visits had already ended. I remember her standing in the doorway, flawless in her designer black dress, sunglasses hiding her eyes as she scanned the house like she was assessing a property. "You look exhausted," were her first words to me. Not a hug, not a "I'm sorry," but a comment on my worn-out appearance after 5 days without proper sleep. That night, as I made tea for my father, I overheard Rebecca on the phone in the backyard, talking about real estate assets and appreciation potential. I assumed it was work, as always. Later, I would understand the true nature of that conversation. With my mother gone, caring for my father became even more intense. His already fragile health seemed to worsen by the week. Dialysis sessions increased to 4 times a week, and his nights were filled with insomnia and shortness of breath episodes that made me sleep in a chair next to his bed. Rebecca returned to New York after 3 days, promising more frequent visits. Visits that never happened. The daily calls at first turned into weekly ones, then bi-weekly, always rushed and filled with practical questions. "How are the finances there? Does Dad need anything special? Have you thought about hiring more help?" she would ask quickly, leaving no space for real answers. 2 months after my mother's passing, I found my father crying in his office, a pile of documents scattered across the old desk. When I asked what was going on, he hurriedly gathered them up, locking them away in a drawer. "Just making sure everything is in order for when I'm gone," he said, wiping his eyes. "Promise me you'll talk to Walter and Michael afterward. Promise me, Diane." I promised, not fully understanding what he meant. That conversation would repeat itself many times in the following months, always with the same cryptic emphasis on Walter and Michael. Summer gave way to fall, and my father's condition deteriorated rapidly. Hospital visits became more frequent, hospital stays grew longer. I ended up sleeping in uncomfortable hospital chairs more often than in my own bed. I found her several times in our father's office, rummaging through drawers and files. When questioned, she always had a plausible explanation, looking for insurance documents, checking unpaid bills, organizing important papers. 5 days after the funeral, Walter called to set up the reading of the will. "We'd better get this settled soon," he said, his voice strangely tense. "Can you bring your sister to my office tomorrow at 10 a.m.? Rebecca received the news with a calmness that seemed rehearsed to me. "Of course we'll be there," she replied, avoiding my gaze as she tucked her phone into her purse. "I imagine it's just a formality." That night, I couldn't sleep. My father's cryptic words about injustices and instructions echoed in my mind. I recalled the times I had caught him hiding documents, his mentions of Walter and Michael, the hushed phone conversations. Something didn't add up, but I was too exhausted, too emotionally drained to piece together the puzzle. I finally fell asleep at dawn, only to be awakened by Rebecca's voice urging me to hurry so we wouldn't be late to Walter's office. The drive to downtown Providence was filled with tense silence. Rebecca kept checking her phone, replying to emails and messages as if we were headed to an ordinary business meeting, not to the reading of our father's will. Walter Green's office was just as I remembered from the few times I had been there. With my parents. Dark wood, law books neatly arranged on towering shelves, the scent of leather and old paper lingering in the air. Walter greeted us at the door, shaking my hand firmly, but hesitating when it came to Rebecca. We sat in leather chairs facing his massive desk. Walter adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began pulling documents from a brown folder. "Before we begin," he said, looking directly at me, "I'd like to express my deepest condolences, Diane. Your father spoke often of your dedication these past few years." Rebecca shifted in her chair, visibly impatient. "Thank you, Walter," I replied, my throat tight with unshed tears. "Dad mentioned you many times. He said you had instructions from him." Something flickered in the lawyer's eyes, alertness, maybe concern. He cast a quick glance at Rebecca before continuing. "Well, let's proceed with the will then," he said, taking out the main document. "This is the most recent version we have, dated 8 months ago." My heart pounded. 8 months ago, my father was already quite frail, often confused. That was about the time when Rebecca had made one of her rare, extended Umschauern visits. Walter began reading the terms, his monotone voice masking the bombshell that was about to explode in my life. As the words flowed, the house to Rebecca, the investments to Rebecca, only a small sum and a few personal items left for me, I felt the blood drain from my face. This wasn't the father who had promised me recognition. This wasn't the man who held my hand in the hospital and spoke of future injustices. This wasn't the Thomas Harrington I had known my entire life. Rebecca kept a solemn expression, but couldn't completely hide the gleam of triumph in her eyes. When Walter finished reading, she turned to me with false compassion. "Dad knew I'd manage the money better, Diane. You've always been so modest in your ambitions. Don't worry, I won't let you go without." It was at that moment that I found my voice, though it trembled. "This doesn't make any sense," I insisted, staring directly at Walter. "Dad promised me. He explicitly said my sacrifice would be recognized." Walter looked uncomfortable, adjusting his glasses repeatedly. "The will was updated 8 months ago, as I mentioned. The signature appears authentic, although." "Promises don't matter. Only legal documents do," Rebecca interrupted, snapping her Italian leather folder shut with a decisive click. "Accept it, Diane. You were always the sensible daughter, the one content with less. That money would be wasted on you." The raw cruelty of her words hit me like a slap. 5 years of my life, sacrificed for this family, reduced to content with less. The injustice was so overwhelming it left me speechless for a moment. "You don't deserve this money, Diane," Rebecca went on, now with the confidence of someone who knows they've won. "While you were playing nurse, I was building a career. Dad knew who was capable of managing the family estate." I looked at Walter, searching for some sign, some explanation for this posthumous betrayal. The attorney avoided my gaze, his reading. Glasses strategically positioned to hide any reaction. Then my father's final words echoed in my mind. "Walter has my instructions, and Michael. Michael holds the key." Something was deeply wrong, and I needed to find out what. I left Walter's office like a sleepwalker, unable to fully process what had just happened. Rebecca walked beside me, her high heels tapping rhythmically against the pavement, like a countdown to my imminent breakdown. "We can get lunch and discuss the next steps," she suggested, her voice modulated in a tone of fake concern. "There are plenty of practical details we need to settle. I need to be alone," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. Rebecca frowned, clearly displeased. "I know this is hard, Di, but we need to be adults about this. I have to be back in New York in 2 days, and I want everything settled before I go." Everything settled, as if my life falling apart was just another item on her to-do list. "Tomorrow," I replied, pulling away. "I can't do this today." I walked home, even though it was nearly 2 kilometers. I needed the movement, the crisp autumn air cutting across my face, the ache in my feet, any physical sensation to anchor me to reality and push away the dizziness of the betrayal I had just suffered. The house, soon no longer mine, felt like a mausoleum when I stepped inside. 5 years of care, of memories, of whispered promises in the dead of night between medications. All reduced to a token mention in a will that contradicted everything my father stood for. I sank into his favorite armchair and finally let the tears come. Not just for the money or the house, though the financial reality was terrifying, but for the feeling that my father's final act was to deny the worth of my sacrifice. The phone rang several times that night. Rebecca, most likely, wanting to sort things out. I let the answering machine pick up the calls, unable to face another condescending conversation. I fell asleep right there, in my father's chair, waking only when the pale morning light filtered through the curtains. My body ached, not just from the uncomfortable position, but as if the emotional pain had settled into every muscle and joint. The sound of the doorbell snapped me out of my daze. I opened the door to find Claire, my doctor friend, holding a paper bag. "Bagels and coffee?" she said, stepping in without waiting for an invitation. "Rebecca called me, said you were processing the news about the will." She made air quotes with her free fingers. I followed her into the kitchen, watching as she moved around comfortably, preparing 2 cups of coffee as she had done countless times over the years when she'd check in on my parents. "So," Claire said, placing a steaming mug in front of me. "Let's hear your version now." I told her everything. The reading of the will, Rebecca's cruel words, the glaring contradiction with my father's promises, the references to Walter and Michael. Claire listened intently, her face showing growing outrage. "This makes no sense at all," she declared when I finished. "Thomas adored you, Diane. Over the past 2 years, every time I came to check on him, he would talk about how proud he was of your sacrifice, your loyalty. Apparently not enough to acknowledge it in his will," I murmured, rubbing my swollen eyes. Claire leaned forward, her expression intensely serious. "Do you really believe that your father, the man we knew, would do this? Leave almost everything to Rebecca after she was practically absent for 5 years?" "The will." "To hell with the will!" Claire interrupted, slamming her hand on the table. "Something's wrong here. Your father was confused in his last months, easily influenced, and Rebecca is, well, Rebecca." A chill ran down my spine as I processed the implication. You think she… I don't know, Claire replied, more composed. But I think you should investigate before just accepting it. You mentioned that your father talked about Walter and Michael having information or instructions. Why not start there? The seed of doubt, already planted by my father's cryptic words, began to sprout with Claire's encouragement. And with it, a small flame of hope. What do I have to lose, right? I said, attempting a weak smile. Claire squeezed my hand across the table. Exactly. Besides, you're a nurse. You saw your father every day. You would know if he was mentally fit to radically change his will 8 months ago. After Claire left, I walked through the house, truly looking at it for the first time since the funeral. Something about my father's study was calling to me. An intuition, maybe. It was the place where I had often found him hiding documents, speaking in hushed tones on the phone, looking secretive. The door was locked, which was unusual. The key, normally kept above the doorframe, was gone. I frowned, trying to remember when I had last been inside. Before the funeral, certainly. After that, Rebecca had spent a lot of time in there organizing papers. Using a technique I had learned as a nurse to open jammed medicine cabinets, I managed to force the lock. The study looked different, neater, cleaner than my father had ever kept it. The desk drawers were locked, the books perfectly aligned. On the shelves, Rebecca had organized the place, but what had she been looking for? And what might she have found, or removed? My phone rang, interrupting my investigation. It was Walter Green, his voice tense even through the line. Diane, could you stop by my office tomorrow? There are some details we need to discuss about your father's will. What kind of details? I asked, my heart pounding, a hesitation. I'd rather not discuss it over the phone. Let's just say some issues have come up that need attention. We hung up with the promise that I would be there at 9 a.m. the next morning. Immediately after, my phone rang again. Diane, it's Rebecca. I just got a very strange call from Walter. He wants to see me tomorrow afternoon. Do you know anything about that? The suspicion in her voice was palpable. No idea. I lied. Maybe it's just some pending paperwork. Her tone made it clear she didn't believe me. Anyway, we need to talk about the house. I was thinking of putting it on the market next week. There's a great real estate market in Providence, right? Now, the speed at which she was planning to get rid of our parents' house shocked me, despite everything. The house we grew up in, where our parents lived for 40 years, you barely waited for Dad's body to get cold. Don't be dramatic, Diane. It's just property now, and one that will need expensive maintenance. I'm practical, not sentimental. We hung up, the air between us more strained than ever. Sitting in the silence of the house that would soon be sold to strangers, I felt a resolve grow within me. My father wouldn't leave me like this, abandoned after years of sacrifice. The cryptic words, the hidden documents, the mentions of Walter and Michael, there was more to this story than the will revealed. The next morning, I arrived at Walter's office precisely at 9 a.m. His secretary, a woman who had worked with him for decades, gave me a conspiratorial smile as she announced my arrival. Walter looked like he had aged 10 years since the reading of the will. Deep, dark circles marked his face, and his hands trembled slightly as he offered me a cup of coffee. Diane, he began, closing the door to his office. First, I must apologize for the awkward situation during the reading of the will. There were circumstances I couldn't discuss in your sister's presence. I felt my pulse quicken. What circumstances? The attorney sighed deeply, removing his glasses to rub his tired eyes. After you and Rebecca left, I began reviewing some of your father's old documents. I found a letter addressed to me, with instructions to open it only after the official reading of the will. He hesitated, as if carefully choosing his words. In the letter, your father expressed concerns about the possibility of undue influence in the preparation of his final will. He instructed me to discreetly investigate certain aspects of the signature, and the circumstances under which the document was drafted. "And what did you find out?" I asked, barely able to breathe. "I found some troubling inconsistencies. The signature on the most recent will, there are problems with it. I can't definitively say it's forged, but it definitely differs from your father's usual signature." Walter opened a folder and showed me several samples of my father's signature on different documents, comparing them to the one on the will. Additionally, one of the witnesses, the gardener who occasionally worked for your parents, admitted, when pressed, that he signed the document without seeing Thomas sign it. He said Rebecca convinced him it was just a formality. My stomach sank with a mixture of nausea and validation. "So the will can be contested?" "Potentially, yes, but it would be a long, costly, and exhausting process. Your sister would certainly fight with everything she has, and will contests can drag on for years." I let out a frustrated sigh. Even with this evidence, the path to justice seemed tortuous and uncertain. "Your father also mentioned a man named Michael Bennett," Walter continued. "He said Michael had important information that would complement what he told me." "Michael, the accountant?" I asked, recalling my father's frequent mentions of him. "He told me several times I should reach out to him." Walter nodded. "Michael Bennett was more than just your father's accountant. They were close friends since college. I strongly recommend you speak with him as soon as possible, before making any decisions about the will." I left Walter's office with a whirlwind of emotions inside me. Anger at Rebecca's apparent manipulation, relief knowing my father likely hadn't betrayed me, and anxiety over what Michael might reveal. In the car, I dialed Michael Bennett's number, which I had found in my father's old address book. A secretary answered, and when I mentioned my name, her tone immediately changed. "Miss Harrington, Mr. Bennett has been expecting your call. Could you come in today at 2 p.m.? The urgency in her voice only intensified my curiosity. What did Michael know that was so important? As I drove home to prepare for the meeting, my phone rang. It was Rebecca, her voice tense like a violin string ready to snap. "What did you say to Walter?" "He just called me, asking very strange questions about Dad's will and how it was signed." "I didn't say anything," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Maybe he's just double-checking some details. It's his job, after all." "Don't give me that, Diane. You're trying to contest the will, aren't you? After everything Dad decided, you can't even respect his final wishes?" The hypocrisy was so blatant I almost laughed. "What last wishes, Rebecca? The ones he told me over and over these past few years, or the ones that magically appeared in a document when he could barely hold a pen?" There was a tense silence. Before she answered, her voice dangerously calm. "Careful, little sister. You're treading on dangerous ground. Take what you got and move on. If you contest this, you'll blow through those pathetic 50 grand on lawyers and end up with nothing." Her veiled threat only fueled my determination. "We'll see, Rebecca. We'll see." We hung up, and I knew the real battle was only just beginning. But first, I had to find out what Michael Bennett knew, what secret he was keeping that could change everything. As I prepared for the decisive meeting with my father's accountant, a small flame of hope began to flicker inside me. Maybe, just maybe, Thomas Harrington had foreseen all of this and set a plan B in motion, and if he had, Rebecca wouldn't know what hit her. Michael Bennett's office was in an old building in downtown Providence, a red brick structure with wrought iron details that harkened back to a more elegant era. As I stepped into the lobby, a knot tightened in my stomach, a mix of hope and fear about what I might uncover. The receptionist ushered me straight into Michael's office as soon as I introduced myself. The accountant, a man with graying hair and an upright posture despite his 54 years, stood to greet me with a somber expression. "Diane," he said, holding my hands in his. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Thomas was one of my dearest friends." "Thank you, Michael. He spoke of you often, especially in these past few months." He gestured to a comfortable chair across from his desk and quietly closed the door, ensuring privacy. For a few moments, he simply observed me, as if evaluating something. "I must admit," he finally began. "I expected your call weeks ago, Thomas was very specific about the timing. Dad knew I would come? Michael gave a faint smile. He knew exactly what would happen after he was gone, including the reading of the official will. He made air quotes around the word official. My heart sped up. So he knew? About Rebecca? Your father wasn't naive, Diane. He knew your sister, maybe better than she thinks. Michael opened a drawer and took out a red folder. Thomas came to me about a year ago. He was worried that someone might try to influence him when he became more vulnerable. Rebecca, I murmured as the pieces started falling into place. He didn't name names at the time, but yes, his concerns were obvious. Michael flipped through a few documents in the folder. Thomas wanted to ensure that his true wishes would be honored, no matter what happened to any official will. What kind of guarantees? Michael slid a set of documents toward me. Your father secretly set up an investment account in your name. He transferred $450,000 into it over the past 14 months, in amounts small enough not to raise suspicion. I stared at the documents, stunned. The amount was exactly the value of the investments that, according to the altered will, were supposed to go to Rebecca. He did this. For me? For you, and because of you. Michael gave a bittersweet smile. The transfer was structured as a series of inter vivos gifts, completely legal and untouchable by any will contest. The money is yours, Diane. It's been yours. For over a year. Tears streamed down my face as I absorbed the information. My father hadn't abandoned me. On the contrary, he had planned everything carefully to protect me. There's more, Michael continued, handing me a sealed envelope. Thomas left this letter for you. He asked me to keep it and only give it to you after the official will was read. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and unfolded the paper, immediately recognizing my father's familiar handwriting, firm and clear, nothing like the shaky signature on the questionable will. My dear Diane, if you are reading this letter, it means my suspicions were correct. The will that was read does not reflect my true wishes, and you are probably feeling betrayed and abandoned. First, I want you to know that I saw everything. Every sleepless night, every lovingly prepared meal, every moment of patience with your mother when even I couldn't manage it. You sacrificed 5 years of your life for us, and no father could ask more of a daughter. Over the years, I watched your sister Rebecca. I always hoped she would mature, that she would realize there are values beyond material success. Sadly, that never happened. In recent months, I noticed her glances toward the house, toward the documents in my office, her persistent questions about my investments. When she began suggesting that I update my will for security, I knew I had to act. That is why, with the help of Michael and Walter, I created this alternative plan. The money in the account that Michael showed you is rightfully yours. It represents recognition for your sacrifice and love. As for the house and the rest of the assets, I leave it to your discretion on how to proceed. Walter has enough evidence to contest the will if you choose to go down that path. I do not seek revenge against Rebecca. She is a product both of her own flaws and of our failure to correct them when she was younger. I know you will do what is right, as you always have. With all my love and gratitude. Dad, I finished reading with tears streaming down my face. My father's voice seemed to echo in every word, his foresight and love evident in every line. He really thought of everything, I whispered. Michael nodded solemnly. Thomas was a careful man. Right after setting up the account for you, he made me promise to keep everything absolutely confidential until the right moment. He had specific concerns about how Rebecca might react if she found out. Walter mentioned irregularities in the will, I said, wiping my tears. Do you think Rebecca actually forged Dad's signature? Michael hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I can't say for sure. What I do know is that Thomas told me, about 8 months ago, that he had refused to sign some documents Rebecca had brought during a visit. Coincidentally, that's the date on the contested will. A chill ran down my spine as I recalled the heated argument I had partially overheard between my father and Rebecca. "You can't do this, Dad," she had said. At the time, I hadn't understood the context. Now everything made sense. "What should I do now?" I asked, feeling both relieved by my father's foresight and apprehensive about the inevitable confrontation with Rebecca. "That's up to you," Michael replied. "Legally, the money is already yours. As for the rest, especially the house, you have two options. Contest the will with Walter's help, which will likely lead to a lengthy legal battle, or confront Rebecca with what we've uncovered and try to reach some kind of agreement." I thought for a few moments, the weight of the decision heavy on me. "I think I need to talk to Walter again first. Understand exactly what evidence he has." Michael agreed. "A wise choice. Thomas also suggested you speak to Walter before any confrontation with Rebecca. He has additional material that could strengthen your position." As I stood to leave, Michael handed me a folder containing all the documents related to the secret account, including access information and details of the transfers. "Your father was very proud of you, Diane," he said gently. "In his final months, even as his health failed, he would smile when talking about how you took care of him. 'My daughter is the best person I know,' he used to say." I left Michael's office with a sense of vindication that wrestled against the grief of my father's death and the disappointment in my sister. Back in the car, I immediately called Walter. "I need to see you as soon as possible," I said as soon as he answered. "I just met with Michael." "I understand," Walter replied, his professional tone barely masking what I suspected was relief. "I can see you in an hour, and Diane, it would be wise not to mention this meeting to your sister just yet." "I wasn't planning to," I replied, noticing 2 missed calls from Rebecca on my phone. As I drove to Walter's office, my phone rang again. "Rebecca," for the 3rd time, I took a deep breath and answered. "Finally, where are you?" Her voice was sharp, almost frantic. "I stopped by Walter's office, and his secretary mentioned you were there this morning. What's going on?" "Just taking care of some details," I answered vaguely. "Nothing important." "Don't lie to me, Diane." Walter asked very specific questions about Dad's will, about the witnesses, about the day it was signed. "What are you insinuating?" "I'm not insinuating anything, Rebecca. If Walter is asking questions, maybe there are legitimate reasons for concern. Of course you can't accept it." She hissed. "It's always been like this. The good daughter, the sacrificial martyr. You can't stand the fact that despite everything, Dad valued me more." The cruelty of her words, so detached from the reality I had just uncovered, almost made me laugh. "I'll see you tomorrow at Walter's office," I replied calmly. "I'm sure all these misunderstandings will be cleared up." Walter greeted me with a formality that quickly gave way to a more open expression once I confirmed my conversation with Michael. "So you already know about the account," he said, visibly relieved. "Thomas made me promise not to say anything until you had spoken with Michael first. It was important to him that you knew he had planned everything, not just reacted to some last-minute emergency." "And Michael mentioned that you have evidence regarding the will," I said. "Something beyond the inconsistencies in the signature." Walter nodded gravely, opening a locked drawer in his desk. "Thomas came to me about 9 months ago, worried that someone might try to manipulate his legal affairs. He authorized me to discreetly install security cameras in his home office." I was stunned. "Cameras? Dad allowed that?" "It was actually his idea," Walter explained. "He said he had noticed documents out of place, drawers tampered with when he wasn't around." Walter pulled out a small storage device. "These recordings show Rebecca on at least 3 different occasions, rummaging through her father's office while he was resting or receiving medical care." He plugged the device into his computer and turned the screen so I could see. The footage was clear, Rebecca meticulously going through drawers, taking photos of documents, and in one instance, even trying to open the wall safe. "This is disturbing," I murmured, watching my own sister act like an intruder in the house where we grew up. "There's more," Walter continued, clicking on another file. This recording is from about 8 months ago, which happens to be the date of the contested will. In the video, Rebecca entered the office accompanied by 2 people I vaguely recognized, the occasional gardener and a woman I believed to be Rebecca's assistant during some of her visits. "I just need your signature here and here," Rebecca was saying to the gardener, pointing to spots on a document. "It's just a formality to validate some of my father's papers while he rests." The gardener looked hesitant. "Shouldn't Mr. Harrington sign first?" Rebecca smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "He already signed his part earlier. I just need witnesses now. Dad's too tired to deal with all this paperwork." Walter paused the video. The document she presented was, almost certainly, the will that was read last week. The gardener confirmed it when I questioned him yesterday. "That's will fraud," I stated, the magnitude of what Rebecca had done finally sinking in. "Exactly," Walter agreed. "With this evidence and the inconsistencies in the signature, we have solid grounds to invalidate the entire will." What would happen then? The previous will would come into effect, the one your father made 2 years ago, dividing all assets equally between you and Rebecca, with a special clause acknowledging your care as deserving of additional compensation. I leaned back in the chair, trying to process it all. And what about the secret account Dad set up for me? That remains untouched. As Michael must have explained, that was structured as inter vivos gifts, legally separated from any issues related to the will. Rebecca can't touch that money, no matter what happens with the estate. A sense of relief and justice began to replace the pain of the past few days. My father had not only protected me financially, but had also given me tools to fight the injustice he had foreseen. "What would be your recommendation now?" I asked. Walter thought for a moment. "Legally, we have a strong case against the fraudulent will. However, contesting a will can take years, draining significant emotional and financial resources, and, well, she's still your sister." "Are you suggesting a settlement?" "I'm suggesting that we consider presenting this evidence to Rebecca first, before starting any formal legal action. Offer her a way to resolve this that avoids harsher consequences." "Legal consequences." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "You mean criminal charges?" I asked, hesitant. Walter nodded gravely. "Will fraud is a crime, Diane. With this evidence, Rebecca could face not only having the will invalidated, but also potential criminal charges. The thought of my own sister facing such serious consequences made me uneasy, despite everything she had done. "I need to think about it," I finally said. "I don't want to destroy Rebecca. I just want justice." "Understandable." Thomas expressed similar feelings. He didn't want revenge, only protection for you, Walter said softly. "I suggest we schedule a meeting with Rebecca tomorrow. We'll present what we've found and offer her a settlement proposal." "What kind of proposal do you have in mind?" "The house would be sold and the proceeds divided equally. You would keep the secret account your father set up. And in exchange, we wouldn't pursue any criminal charges related to the forgery of the will." It sounded fair, more than fair, considering what Rebecca had tried to do. "I agree," I said at last. "Set up the meeting." I left Walter's office with a strange mix of emotions, relief over my father's plan, sorrow over Rebecca's betrayal, and apprehension about the confrontation to come. When I got home, I found Rebecca waiting on the porch, her stiff posture betraying her anxiety. "Where have you been?" she demanded as soon as I stepped out of the car. "I've been calling you all day." "Taking care of important matters," I said simply. "Walter wants to see us tomorrow at 10 a.m. Rebecca narrowed her eyes, studying my face. "You found something out, didn't you? You're scheming something." For the first time in days, I felt in control of the situation. "Tomorrow, Rebecca. Everything will be clear tomorrow." She opened her mouth to protest, but something in my expression made her stop. With one last suspicious glance, she walked to the rental car and drove off, leaving me alone with my parents' memories. and the certainty that the truth would finally come out. That night, sitting on the porch where my father used to gaze at the stars, rereading his letter, and organizing the documents Michael had given me, I felt a peace I hadn't felt in years. My father's plan B wasn't just about money. It was his final act of love, protecting me even after he was gone. Tomorrow, Rebecca would learn that all her professional success in New York hadn't prepared her to face our father's foresight. The morning arrived heavy with dark clouds that promised rain, a fittingly dramatic backdrop for the confrontation about to unfold. I took care getting ready, choosing simple but elegant clothes. I wanted to feel confident without looking like I was trying too hard. I arrived at Walter's office exactly at 9:30 a.m., half an hour before the scheduled time. He was already waiting for me, accompanied by Michael Bennett. "We thought it wise to have Michael present," Walter explained, gesturing toward the accountant. "As the administrator of the secret account and a witness to your father's intentions, he adds an important layer of credibility." Nodding, I placed on the table the folder of documents I had gathered, including my father's letter. The three of us spent the next few minutes reviewing our strategy, like generals before a decisive battle. "We don't want to come across as accusatory right away," Walter suggested, meticulously adjusting some papers. "First, I'll present the inconsistencies in the will as technical matters that need clarification." Michael agreed. The revelation about the secret account should come later, once Rebecca is already on the defensive about the will. I glanced at the clock, 9:55. My stomach twisted into knots, not from fear, but from a strange sense of anticipation. For the first time since my father's death, I felt like justice might finally be served. At 10:02, Walter's secretary announced Rebecca's arrival. My sister walked into the room as she did in any setting, as though she were the most important person there. She wore a flawless gray blazer over a silk blouse, discreet yet obviously expensive jewelry, and an air of impatience she could barely conceal. Her eyes registered Michael's unexpected presence with obvious surprise, but she quickly composed her expression. "Good morning, everyone," she said, setting her Hermes bag on an empty chair. "I hope we can resolve any pending issues quickly. I have a flight to New York at 3. I noticed she was wearing a diamond brooch I immediately recognized, a piece that had belonged to our mother, one we had agreed years ago would come to me after her passing. A small detail, but it spoke volumes about how Rebecca saw our inheritance, already claiming everything for herself, with no regard for promises or feelings. Walter cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses in a gesture I now recognized as his way of buying time. "Ms. Rebecca, thank you for coming. As I mentioned on the phone, some technical issues have arisen regarding your father's will that we need to clarify." Rebecca shot me a suspicious glance before responding. "What kind of technical issues?" Walter opened a folder and pulled out the contested will. "First of all, there are some inconsistencies with your father's signature on this document. Our preliminary analysis indicates potential discrepancies when compared with other authenticated signatures." Rebecca's face remained impassive, but I noticed a slight stiffening in her posture. "Dad was ill. His signature naturally varied depending on how he felt that day." "Understandable," Walter agreed in a professional tone. "However, there are also issues regarding the document's witnesses." He slid another paper across the table, a signed statement from the gardener. "Mr. Rodriguez claims he signed this document without seeing your father sign it. In fact, he says you told him your father had already signed earlier and was too tired to deal with paperwork." Rebecca's face paled slightly, but her voice stayed firm. "Rodriguez is confused. He witnessed the signature. He just doesn't remember it correctly." "That's possible," Walter replied, his tone neutral. However, Mrs. Jenkins, the second witness, also provided a similar statement. Rebecca shifted in her chair, crossing her legs in a move that seemed casual, but I recognized it as a sign of growing discomfort. "These people were probably influenced," she argued, staring directly at me. "We all know how close Diane was to them, taking care of the house while I was building my career." The insinuation was clear, that I had manipulated the witnesses. I stayed silent, following the plan to let Walter lead this part of the conversation. There's also the matter of timing, Walter continued. The will is dated 8 months ago, during a period when, according to your father's medical records, he was on heavy medication that significantly affected his motor coordination and mental clarity. Rebecca began tapping her fingers on the table, her first visible sign of nervousness. He had good days and bad days. Obviously, we chose a good day to handle these matters. Interesting that you say, "we chose," Walter noted, raising his eyebrows. I'm curious about your involvement in the process. Rebecca realized her slip but quickly recovered. Naturally, I accompanied Dad in important matters like this. He trusted my business judgment. Walter nodded as if considering her explanation reasonable, then slid another document across the table. A printout of a security video frame showing Rebecca in the office with the witnesses, without our father present. This is a security record from your father's office, on the exact day the will was supposedly signed. Rebecca's face grew even paler. There were cameras? Since when? Your father had them installed about 9 months ago, Walter answered calmly. He was concerned about the security of his important documents. Rebecca turned to me, her eyes now blazing with anger. Did you know about this? Is that why you're smiling like a cat that just swallowed a canary? Before I could respond, Walter intervened. Actually, Diane only learned about the cameras yesterday. It was a step your father took independently, for reasons that now seem quite justified. Rebecca stood up abruptly, walking over to the window. Her tense silhouette against the gray light of the rainy day seemed to symbolize her growing isolation as her schemes were exposed. This is ridiculous, she finally said, turning to face us. You're trying to paint me as some kind of villain. Dad wanted me to manage the family estate. I was always the one with business sense, not Diane with her nursing career. The way she said, nursing, like it was something lesser, insignificant, sparked a flame of indignation inside me. It was time to speak up. Interesting that you mentioned that, Rebecca, I said, keeping my voice calm despite the rising anger. Because while you belittle my profession, it was that very career that allowed me to care for our parents for 5 years, while you could barely manage to visit them once every 3 months. Rebecca rolled her eyes dramatically. Here, we go with the martyr act again. You chose that role, Diane. Nobody forced you to give up your job. Someone had to be there, I replied simply. And you made it very clear it wasn't going to be you. Because I was building something important, she snapped. I was securing my future, our family's future. Building so hard that you couldn't spare more than 2 days for Mom's funeral? I asked, the hurt of years seeping into my voice. Walter cleared his throat again, steering the conversation back. Ladies, returning to the matter of the will. With the evidence we have, there's substantial ground to contest it legally. The previous will from 2 years ago would then be considered valid. Rebecca sat back down, visibly shaken. And what did that previous will say? I'd split the assets equally between you two. Walter replied, with an additional provision recognizing Diane's caregiving efforts, granting her an extra $100,000. Rebecca let out a dry laugh. So that's it? All this theater to secure a better deal for yourself, Diane? It was then that Michael, who had remained silent until that moment, finally spoke up. Actually, Miss Harrington, there's another element we haven't discussed yet. Rebecca turned to him as if noticing his presence for the first time. And you're relevant to this conversation because Michael was Dad's accountant and close friend, I explained, and keeper of an important secret. Michael opened his briefcase and took out documents related to a secret account, placing them on the table. Your father came to me about a year ago, he began, his voice professional. He was worried someone might try to influence him. When his health declined, he wanted assurances that his true wishes would be respected. Rebecca looked at the documents with growing apprehension. What kind of assurances? He secretly set up an investment account in Diane's name, Michael explained. He transferred $450,000 to her over the course of several months, in discrete installments. Rebecca's face drained of all remaining color. $450,000? Yes, Michael confirmed. Exactly the amount that, according to the contested will, was supposed to go to you along with the family house. This is... Rebecca seemed to struggle to find the words. This is manipulation. He couldn't do this. Actually, he could, Walter replied. These were inter vivos gifts, completely legal and beyond the reach of any will contest. The money has legally belonged to Diane for over a year now. Rebecca looked at me, a mixture of anger and disbelief in her eyes. You knew about this the whole time? You were playing me? I found out yesterday, I answered honestly. Dad left specific instructions for Michael to tell me only after the official reading of the will. Your father anticipated exactly this. Scenario, Miss Rebecca, Walter added. He made alternative arrangements to ensure that his true wishes would be fulfilled, regardless of any manipulation of the official will. The full meaning of the situation finally seemed to hit Rebecca. Her carefully laid plan to take everything had been foreseen and neutralized by our father long before his death. Dad didn't trust me, she murmured, more to herself than to us. He really didn't trust me. He knew you, I said softly. He knew both of us. Rebecca stood up again, pacing around the room like a caged animal. And now? Are you going to sue me? Ruin my reputation? Destroy my career? Walter exchanged a look with me before answering. That depends on you, Miss Rebecca. We have enough evidence to invalidate the fraudulent will and potentially pursue criminal charges for forgery and testamentary fraud. The word criminal seemed to hit her like a physical blow. Rebecca clung to the edge of the table, her face now completely pale. However, Walter continued, Diane has expressed a desire to resolve this peacefully, if possible. Rebecca looked at me, genuine surprise in her eyes. You don't want to sue me? I shook my head slowly. I don't want to destroy you, Rebecca. I just want justice. Walter then presented our proposal. The house would be sold and the money divided equally. I would keep the secret account our father had created, and there would be no criminal charges for testamentary fraud if Rebecca agreed to the terms. Thomas wanted protection, not revenge, Walter explained. He still loved both his daughters. He just recognized their true natures. Rebecca remained silent for several minutes, taking it all in. When she finally spoke, her voice lacked its usual confidence. I really thought I deserved more, she said almost in a whisper. I spent my whole life trying to prove my worth, building my career, while you... She looked at me. You always seemed to have his approval without even trying. Without trying? I repeated, incredulous. Rebecca, I sacrificed 5 years of my life. I slept in hospital chairs, cleaned up after our parents when they couldn't do it themselves, listened to Mom call me by your name during her Alzheimer's. How is that without trying? Something seemed to crack in my sister's expression, a facade carefully maintained for decades. For a brief moment, I glimpsed the insecure little girl behind the ruthless executive. I should have been there more, she admitted, so softly I could barely hear her. But every time I visited, I felt so... inadequate. You always knew exactly what to do, how to care for them. I only knew how to take pictures and send money. This unexpected confession, the closest Rebecca had ever come to admitting her faults, caught me off guard. For a moment, I felt a pang of compassion for my sister, who had spent her life chasing approval she believed she never fully had. Before I could respond, Rebecca swayed slightly, her face now a frightening shade of white. I don't feel well, she murmured, bringing a hand to her forehead. Walter stood to offer her some water, but before he could reach her, Rebecca's knees buckled. Michael and I rushed to catch her as she slid to the floor, unconscious. Rebecca, I called out, kneeling beside her, instinctively checking her vitals like the nurse I am. Call an ambulance, I instructed Walter, who was already dialing. The next few moments were a blur of activity, the ambulance arriving, paramedics rushing. Into the office, Rebecca being placed on a stretcher. Her fainting spell, apparently, was due to a sharp drop in blood pressure brought on by the intense stress of the situation. I'm going with her, I decided, following the stretcher. Despite everything, she was still my sister. At the hospital, sitting by her bedside as she received IV fluids, I had time to reflect on the strange path that had led us here. This was not how I had imagined our confrontation ending, with Rebecca vulnerable and me once again in the role of caretaker. When she finally regained full consciousness, hours later, she seemed like a different woman than the confident one who had walked into Walter's office that morning. Her face, free of makeup, revealed lines of exhaustion she usually kept carefully hidden. "Why are you here?" were her first words, her voice hoarse. "Because you fainted," I answered simply. "No," she shook her head weakly. "Why are you here after everything I tried to do?" I considered the question for a moment, searching for an honest answer. "Because it's what I've always done, Rebecca. I take care of people when they need it, even when they don't deserve it." She looked away, fixing her gaze on the hospital window. "You must be loving this." The wicked sister finally knocked off her pedestal. "I'm not loving any of this," I replied sincerely. "I just wish Dad were here so we wouldn't have to go through all this." A heavy silence fell between us, filled only by the beeping of monitors and the distant noise of the hospital. "Were you telling the truth?" she finally asked. "About not wanting to sue me?" "Yes. I don't see what good would come of it." Rebecca closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, I saw something I rarely associated with my sister: resignation. "I accept the terms," she said softly. "The house will be split. You'll get the money Dad set aside. No contest." I nodded, feeling not triumph, but a strange mix of relief and sadness. "Walter will prepare the papers. You know what's the most pathetic part?" she continued, a bitter smile on her lips. "I don't even really need that money. My career's doing well. I have my own investments. It was more about winning, I guess. It's always been like that between us." "It didn't have to be a competition, Rebecca." "Maybe not for you, but for me it always was." She took a deep breath. "You were his favorite. You always were." I shook my head, surprised by this distorted perception. Funny. For years I thought the exact opposite, that you were his favorite, the shining star who inherited Mom's charisma. Rebecca gave a faint laugh. "What a pair we make, huh? Each of us thinking the other had what we wanted." The doctor walked in at that moment, interrupting our conversation. Rebecca would be discharged the next day after one more night under observation. I promised to come in the morning to pick her up, despite her initial protests that she could just call a cab. As I left the room, I turned back one last time. "Oh, Rebecca? Mom's diamond brooch, the one you're wearing. Remember we agreed, years ago, that it would come to me?" She touched the brooch on her hospital gown collar, where the nurses had pinned it after removing her blouse. "I remember," she replied softly. "Sorry, I'll give it back tomorrow." It was a small victory, insignificant compared to everything else. But as I walked through the hospital corridors, such a familiar environment for me, I felt that something fundamental had shifted between my sister and me. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet. Maybe we'd never fully get there. But for the first time in decades, there was something close to honesty between us. And that, I realized, was worth more than any inheritance. The days that followed the confrontation in Walter's office brought a strange mix of relief and melancholy. With the agreement signed and the truth finally out, a tense peace settled between Rebecca and me. Not quite reconciliation, but a cautious truce. Rebecca stayed in Providence for another week, just long enough for us to finalize the practical details of our new reality. The house would be put up for sale, but not with the rush she had initially wanted. We agreed to hire a reputable appraiser and give the market time to find a fair value for the property that held so many family memories. I spent those days sorting through our parents' personal belongings, separating what each of us would keep, what would be donated, and what simply no longer made sense to hold on to. Rebecca was more involved in that process than I had expected, sometimes pausing to look at an old photograph or some seemingly trivial object with an expression I had rarely seen on her face, genuine nostalgia. "Remember this?" she asked one afternoon, holding up a small, dusty softball trophy. You won this at the regional championship when you were 12. Dad was so proud he insisted on putting it on the main shelf in the living room. I remember, I replied, surprised that she recalled that detail. You said it was a waste of space and that no one cared about softball. Rebecca gave a faint smile. I was jealous. I've always been terrible at sports, and you looked so natural out there on the field. Those small moments of connection, rare and fragile, dotted that week like scattered stars in a cloudy sky. They didn't erase decades of rivalry and resentment, but they hinted at the possibility, however remote, of something different in the future. On the eve of her return to New York, Rebecca handed me a small box during dinner. They're some of Mom's jewelry, she explained, avoiding my gaze. The diamond brooch, the pearl necklace she wore at the wedding, a few other pieces that should be yours. I opened the box in silence, recognizing every item. These were exactly the jewels we had verbally agreed, years ago, would come to me before Rebecca's greed clouded her better judgment. Thank you, I said simply. She nodded, pushing her food around without actually eating. I'm not doing this to redeem myself. I know some things can't be fixed. I wasn't expecting redemption, I answered honestly. But I appreciate the gesture anyway. When her taxi arrived the next morning to take her to the airport, Rebecca paused briefly in the doorway, as if she wanted to say something else. Instead, she offered an awkward hug, the first genuine physical contact between us in years. I'll let you know when I get to New York, she said, pulling away quickly. And I'll be available by phone for anything about the house. I watched the taxi disappear around the corner, feeling a strange mix of relief and emptiness. The battle was over, but what now? 5 years devoted entirely to caring for my parents had left me without a professional anchor, without clear plans for the future. A week after Rebecca left, I transferred the mine 450,000 euro wide from my father's secret account into a new account in my name. Sitting in the bank manager's office, watching him finalize the transfer, I felt an overwhelming rush of emotions. Money wasn't just financial security. It was my father's last act of love and protection, his way of ensuring that my sacrifice would be acknowledged. Your father was a thoughtful man, the manager commented, handing me the final documents. Few people think so far ahead to protect their loved ones. He knew the people around him very well, I replied, signing where indicated. Better than we realized. With the financial safety net my father's plan B provided, I could finally afford something I hadn't had in the past 5 years. Time to reflect, to heal, to carefully consider my next step. It was during this period of reflection that the idea first appeared, initially just a fleeting thought, then solidifying into something more concrete as I researched and spoke with Claire and other professionals. 2 weeks later, I shared my plans with Sarah, my cousin, over lunch. A foundation? She repeated, intrigued. For family caregivers. Not just a foundation, I explained, feeling a surge of excitement as I gave voice to the idea. A full resource center for families caring for relatives with Alzheimer's and other degenerative diseases. Legal guidance, psychological support, hands-on training, even respite care services so caregivers can have a few hours to rest. Sarah smiled, squeezing my hand across the table. It's perfect, Diane. A way to honor your parents and turn your experience into something positive for others. In the months that followed, I dedicated myself entirely to the project. I used a significant part of my inheritance to establish the Harrington Foundation for Family Caregivers, a name that paid tribute to my parents while embracing a greater mission. My experience as a nurse, combined with years of family caregiving, gave me a unique perspective on the real needs and challenges faced by those who give up their lives to care for loved ones. My parents' house was sold 6 months later for a price higher than expected. The Providence real estate market was booming, just as Rebecca had predicted. We split the proceeds equally, as agreed. To my surprise, Rebecca transferred her half to the foundation's account, with a brief note. To help other Dianes not have to go through what you did alone. This isn't redemption, just acknowledgement. We didn't respond at the time, letting the gesture speak for itself. Some wounds are too deep to fully heal, but over time, they can turn into less painful scars. The foundation grew faster than I could have imagined. In its first year, we were already serving over 200 families across New England, offering everything from free legal consultations to weekly support groups. I hired nurses, social workers, and psychologists, many of them with personal experience as family caregivers. The Manas. Providence Journal published a feature about our work, highlighting how the foundation filled a crucial gap in the healthcare system. 2 weeks later, I received an email from Rebecca with a link to the article and a simple message. Dad would be proud. It was our first exchange in months that didn't involve practical matters about the house sale or legal documents. I replied with equal simplicity, Mom would be too. On the first anniversary of my father's passing, I visited the cemetery alone, bringing flowers for both graves. Autumn had painted the trees around me in shades of red and gold, creating a serene beauty that contrasted with the still present, though less sharp, pain. Sitting on the bench near their headstones, I spoke to my parents in silence, telling them about the foundation, about my progress in healing emotionally, about the small but meaningful signs of change in my relationship with Rebecca. I've learned that justice doesn't always come from the places we expect. I whispered, running my fingers over the cold marble of my father's stone. Some call it karma, others call it foresight. I call it a father's love that saw more than he ever let on. As I stood to leave, I noticed a familiar figure a few feet away. Rebecca, holding a bouquet, watching me hesitantly. She hadn't mentioned she would be in Providence that weekend. Our eyes met across the distance. After a moment of hesitation, I motioned for her to come closer. She walked slowly toward the graves, placing her flowers next to mine. We stood in silence for a few minutes, each lost in our own thoughts. It was Rebecca who finally broke the silence. I saw the Foundation's mid-year report, she said. The work you're doing, it's incredible, Diane. Thank you, I replied. It's been healing in a way. She nodded, understanding. Another silence followed, softer and less tense than before. I'm seeing a therapist, she said abruptly. For the first time in my life, we're working on some old issues. The confession caught me off guard. Rebecca had always considered therapy a sign of weakness, something for people who couldn't just get over their problems. That's brave of you, I replied sincerely. She let out a short, humorless laugh. Brave or desperate? After everything that's happened, I realized I don't really like the person I've become. Or maybe I never really did. Maybe I was just good at pretending. As we left the cemetery, Rebecca suggested we grab a coffee. For the next hour, we talked. Really talked, for the first time in decades. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation, nor a full resolution of all the past wounds. It was something more modest, yet perhaps more meaningful. A small step toward something different than what we had before. Before we said goodbye, she handed me an envelope. It's an invitation, she explained. My company is hosting a fundraiser for healthcare organizations next month. I thought maybe the Harrington Foundation could participate. I know people who might be interested in your work. I accepted the envelope, touched by the gesture. Thank you. I'll seriously consider it. On my way home, I checked my phone and found a message from Rebecca, sent just moments after we had parted. Some wounds never fully heal, but maybe it's time to start healing this one. Can we try? I stared out the car window at the autumn sky, thinking about everything we had been through, our competitive childhood, years of estrangement, the lonely care of our parents, the betrayal of the will, the confrontation, and now, this fragile beginning of something new. My fingers hesitated over the keyboard for a few moments before I typed my reply. We can try. That night, I revisited my father's letter, his words now carrying new meaning after everything that had happened. My father had not only protected me financially, he had, in a way, protected the possibility of a different future for our family, even when he wouldn't be there to see it. The justice he had so carefully planned wasn't just about money or property. It was about truth, about natural consequences, about allowing each person to face the reality of their choices, including the possibility of making different choices in the future. The Harrington Foundation continued to grow in the following years, expanding its services to neighboring states. My relationship with Rebecca evolved slowly. We never became best friends, but we developed a mutual respect and appreciation for each other's strengths, something we had never truly acknowledged before. Eventually, I returned part-time to nursing, working as a health consultant for the foundation and overseeing our caregiver training programs. Rebecca, for her part, began to dedicate some of her time and marketing expertise to help raise the visibility of our work. One quiet afternoon, 3 years after my father's death, I found a small note he had written, hidden between the pages of his favorite book that I had kept. A simple message that seemed to capture his quiet wisdom perfectly. The true inheritance is not in the possessions we leave behind, but in the lessons we plant. Some seeds take longer to grow, but with time and care, even the toughest soil can bloom. I sent a picture of the note to Rebecca. Her reply came hours later. He always knew we would eventually find our way, even when we doubted it ourselves. It was at that moment that I fully understood my father's true plan B, not just the 450,000 sows, to ensure my financial security, but a deeper strategy to perhaps force us to confront the truths we had avoided for decades. The journey had begun with betrayal and heartbreak. It didn't end with a perfectly happy reconciliation, but with something more real and perhaps more valuable. Two imperfect sisters finally finding a way to coexist with authenticity and mutual respect. And that, I realized, would have been the greatest joy for my parents, a legacy no will could ever quantify.